Okay, we will be diving into why biology is important for understanding emotion. And this is by myself, Cassidy Glover. I would like to provide some visuals. When we look at this visual, we see that there's 3 images, but there's lots of colors, dots, lines, zigzags, flowy lines. What else? There's lots of stuff, right? And some of it might look a little confusing, or we might not even be able to tell what it is or how this might apply to what this slideshow is about. So that is quite literally the point. When we think of biology and the brain, and we ask someone, how do you think that biology impacts our emotions? At first thought, that probably seems very out there, like, well, maybe it doesn't, or I have no idea. So I would like to dive into that throughout the presentation, make it a little bit easier to understand, and hopefully at the end we can soak up all the info and be able to recite why biology is indeed important in understanding our emotions. What is biology? On this slide, I want to go into the more detailed definitions about what biology is and what emotion is. I'm sure we can all remember in our 8th grade biology class the definition that they defined biology as the study of life. And it definitely is the study of life, but it's also the scientific study of all living organisms and their physiological processes and evolution. This ties into talking about emotions because there's multiple components of emotions. They have valence, they're functional, multifaceted, and they mediate concerns with the environment. As we go through, there will be more interaction of how we see what emotion is and what biology is and how they coexist together. And you see one come after the other and so forth. The biological approach is oriented to show how biology does play a role with emotions, and also how it impacts psychology. The biological approach is defined as the consequence of our genetics and our physiology. In psychology, it examines our thoughts, feelings, and our behaviors. It shows how and what genetics are inherited from our parents, as well as the physiology that exists in relation to our enacted behaviors that are created based on our emotions. Now, there are physiological and cognitive processes that play a role in our emotions. It is vital that we understand that the biological approach to behaviors and how the responses are of our emotions. The biological approach also provides predictions about effects that neurotransmitters have and our biological makeup that is scientifically found and proven. When psychology first started being developed, there was lots of topic of conversation about it being a scientific study, if there was science in psychology, essentially. The biological approach was one of the first approaches that we could use to say that there are significant concepts in psychology that are scientifically found and proven. It also brings some advantages to the table of understanding how our brain works in relation to our emotions, behaviors, and feelings. To really understand our psychological being, we have to understand that everything is first physiological. I think that's a very powerful statement. Everything that we're going to experience psychologically, we are first going to experience it physiologically. It's how we can understand our processes. Our biological makeup is what sets the foundation to all else, right? That existed, we existed as cells and began to evolve as humans, and even from being conceived until birth, right? There's lots of biological things occurring. There is biological cause to our feelings and behaviors. The relevant relevancy of biology to us in emotion and psychology is that it exposes our genetic inheritance from our parents, including our diseases, hormones, brain functions, and more. Our physiology is our nervous system, so our hormones, how our brain functions are working, our organs, and so forth. And if these structures ever do change, we will see effects on all other aspects of our biological makeup and our minds. So we can see an effect in our behaviors, we can see an effect in our emotions. We could see effects in a lot of places in our life, personality-wise, education-wise, if any of these structures do ever change. A good example would be if someone gets hurt or breaks a bone. Usually, well, we won't generalize, but sometimes there is mental effects that will come after, right? Because maybe someone broke their ankle and now they can't participate in their favorite sport, and that's going to make them very angry. They might develop a bit of depression because they're not getting their exertion and activity that they favor, and that effect goes on to like a domino effect, and we go back to where it all started, which is a biological aspect of breaking something or hurting something physiologically, then impacting our psychological state. Biological perspectives in psychology is our next focus. We have a nice little picture of Charles Darwin here in the left corner, with a thought bubble saying psychology should be seen as a science, which is something that we touched on a little bit earlier, but we're going to dive in a little bit deeper now to it. Biology does have a major role in psychology. There are many perspectives to be learned that all try to understand human behaviors, that of which will allow us to interpret our emotions as well. It's very important that we understand these perspectives so that we can get a better understanding for humans in general and their emotions as well. All the way back to Charles Darwin, he lived from 1809 to 1882. He had many theories, but one that I think will really help us to understand the significant role of biology, especially in emotions, is his discovery of evolution and how genetics play a role in human behavior. Darwin states that there are certain patterns that are passed down among generations, and the patterns working effectively will continue to be passed down to other generations, and the ones that don't work will die off. Most patterns that were found to be passed down successfully were ones that aided in survival, which kind of leads us into natural selection and nature versus nurture, and the argument that those have. Nature versus nurture is another concept from the biological perspective in psychology. Nature is going to take the role of biological perspectives, meaning a person's characteristics and how they're influenced by our innate biological factors. The nurture aspect is going to be the environment around an individual, culture, social aspects, and so forth. Our environment shapes our human behavior and our development, but it was determined that we need the influence of both our environment and the biology contributing to human behavior in order for development to occur. There is also the comparative method, which will allow us to study different species and compare them in order to understand emotions. We will touch on this concept a little bit further into the presentation, but I wanted to highlight it as it is also a biological perspective in psychology. The next biological perspective that I wanted to dive into is neurobiology. Neurobiology is the only path to understanding how we feel. It's also very important that we take animals' emotions seriously when we're trying to understand the feelings of other animals. it can also help us to understand the emotions of ourselves. So primal emotions are our feelings. The brain releases chemicals in response to some behaviors which make us feel some emotions. I have an example of that. Brain opioids. They are addictive feelings that we get from mother's love. It releases oxytocin, in which we feel the warmth, and we also get decreased heart rate among some other physiological factors. I think that this is very important to understand that other animals also resemble biological aspects of emotion. We are not the only mammals that experience that motherly love. It was seen in rats and monkeys as well, that the brain actually releases chemicals when we are going through those emotions. And we learn that from animals first. So it is important that we tune in to things that are happening with animals in order to apply it to humans and help us understand our own emotions that much better. All right, so another biological perspective is a interesting story that I wanted to touch on here, showing how implications or injuries to our biological systems will impact emotions and cognitive processes. So, Phineas Gage is the story I wanted to tell. You might have heard of him. His duration of life was 1823 to 1860. He worked for a railroad as a foreman. He had a traumatic brain injury when he was using a tamping rod to pack explosive powder into the hole on the railroad. The powder detonated, and the iron rod had shot through his skull and dismantled the left frontal lobe of his brain. The rod that had entered his brain was about 40 inches long and had a diameter of about 1.25 inches. Phineas Gage did survive this accident. It occurred in 1848. Immediately after the accident had occurred, he was about to speak and he was conscious. So there was immediate assurance that everyone had thought that he was okay, consciousness and still able to talk. Gage had suffered no motor or speech impairments. His memory did not suffer from this incident, but he did have some other pretty significant changes. Like he was very restless, he was very disrespectful, and he was very unreliable, among some other traits that had changed. But this was reported that it was very different from what his personality was like before the accident. Now, Phineas Gage did live on about 12 years after the accident happened. But we're wondering how this could be, how he suffered all of these personality changes, this impaired judgment, frustration. And we might be able to answer this question if we tune in and look at the functions of the brain. So, how did our biological makeup, if it's damaged, affect our emotions and our personality traits? How is that possible? So we're going to look into the frontal lobe, specifically where the injury occurred, and see what its functions are, and then we may be able to analyze why he suffered the changes that he did. So after some research, we saw that the frontal lobe actually carries functions like our language, our social skills, and in fact, it is the most prone to injury. So extensive research has already been done on symptoms that occur if damage happens to that part of the brain. So we will see changes in mood, lack of impulse control, reduced motivation, impaired judgment, atypical social skills, and so forth. And if we go back and talk about what Gage had suffered after his injury, this all makes complete sense, right? The frontal lobe was damaged. Gage was being rude and disrespectful. He was unreliable, and this aligns with the functions that the frontal lobe carries out, and when it's damaged, with the effect that we will see. To understand our emotions and the biological significance that our bodies and brains play a role in our emotions, I think it's pretty important that we go into the brain structures that are going to actually interact with our emotions. So to start, we're going to get to know the brain and its systems and its regions and how they all play a role in our emotions that we may experience. Without the biological aspect of all these functions, we wouldn't really have any awareness as to why we experience the emotions we do and where they come from biologically. There are lots of discoveries being made to aid research in finding all functions of the biological aspects to our emotions. One brain system study that was very interesting was the discovery of optogenetics, which is a technique that was developed in neuroscience that is a genetically modified light-sensitive gene, and it gets injected into specific cells. It then will give the researchers the power to turn on those cells, and they turn them on and off. That is turning on neurons in the hypothalamus with that burst of light, also turning those neurons off in the hypothalamus with the burst of light. Optogenetics was a pretty huge development to be able to pick out the functions of different neurons among the billions of neurons that exist in our brain. It was tested on rats, and this far the results are pretty astounding. When the gene is activated, the rats would become very aggressive and attack. No matter what is happening around them or who is around them or where they are, they would just attack. So overall, what it showed was that when certain neurons get turned on and that aggressive behavior is enacted, it will help researchers to map the circuit of behaviors overall through neurons, through optogenetics, which is very cool. Very great development for us to follow emotions and see how in our biological systems our emotions can be impacted by even a single neuron. Next, I want to talk about brain lesions. I think this is significant because, like we talked about with Phineas Gage, if there is a certain injury to a part of the brain, or we can stimulate a specific part of the brain, we get a different outcome. And if we could do this to see what happens to our emotions, we could find some pretty cool discoveries assimilating biology to emotions. So a study was done with two groups. One group was having had experienced a stroke, and the other was a control group. Farinelli, researcher, among other researchers, wanted to investigate the basic emotions and attachment styles in this sample of patients. They used personality skills and questionnaires, and they were able to come up with many findings. This study was actually some of the first empirical evidence that basic emotions like seeking, sadness, fear, and anger are affected by strokes and generally just lesions in the brain. When there is damage to the subcortical and medial regions in the brain, there are emotional changes that will occur. They conducted that emotions differ significantly when the brain areas are lesioned versus when they are intact. The study also concluded that basic emotions were impacted significantly more than attachment styles were in the face of brain injury. Strokes impair more than just our motor functions. They enable parts of the brains from functioning, and then when they're not functioning properly, it will inhibit the expression and the creations of emotions. This was done with the sample groups and produced some pretty good evidence to show how, once again, that biological makeup is significantly impacted and enhances or inhibits our emotion. To distinguish emotions biologically, we can take a look at some physiological markers of emotion. Some of those reside with the autonomic nervous system, which is consistent of the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. A state of emotions can be associated with bodily and cognitive states. Specifically, we can see the results of the autonomic nervous system. Consisting of both of those, sympathetic and parasympathetic, they both will have physiological conditions that will be visible for interpretation. The sympathetic nervous system is associated with our flight or fight response. Most likely we'll experience this in situations of fear or anger, surrounded by a threat or what our body detects to be dangerous. Our body will coincide with this emotion, and bodily changes will occur once we are in that sympathetic nervous system, including the dilation of our pupils, increased adrenaline, a high respiratory rate, slowed digestion, and decreased salivation. All things that occur with our bodily changes occur because they're not necessary to help with the occurring emotion. Per the situation that we're in. So we don't need our digestive system working very hard when we're in a dangerous situation, right? We need our pupils to be dilated so we can see. We need our adrenaline increased so that we can act if need be, and so forth. So on the other hand, our parasympathetic nervous system will resemble a rest and digestive state. So this is going to occur when we have a calm or content state of mind and body. The bodily changes that we see happening here would be our pupils are constricting, a decreased heart rate, increased digestion, decreased adrenaline. Basically all the opposite of the sympathetic nervous system, because when we're calm and content, we don't need our heart rate to be increased. We don't need our pupils to be dilated, right? We're calm. We can increase our digestion so that other functions of the body can work. It is the physiological ways that our body interprets what emotional state is occurring, and then our body will tell us how to respond based on the physiological changes that do occur. I have placed a couple diagrams in this PowerPoint. That is the picture of the brain with parts of the brain that are lit up. That comes from an fMRI scan that is done to see when you hear certain things or you experience certain things, pictures, words, noises, what part of your brain will light up per what emotion is going on, which is really cool advanced technology that we have to kind of analyze where things are happening in our brain. So I have a picture of that. I also have a picture of the human body, and it explains when we feel emotions, where are they happening all over our body, and what emotion is going to trigger certain parts of the body. So if you want to take a look at those pictures, I think they're very explanatory and provide some good information about how we're distinguishing our emotions biologically as well. Those physiological markers that occur in the autonomic nervous system, they're all markers for the emotional states that are occurring with us, which is why I did place those diagrams to help kind of explain that as well. How emotions are expressed is an important concept to learn so that we can interpret, visualize, and understand the way that emotions work. We have to know how we're going to see them expressed biologically and why that happens. Emotion expressions, they affect the entire person and they involve many systems that react, including the motor, somatic, hormonal, neurochemical, and a few more. Emotions rely on principles of biology to fully utilize their functionality. Emotions trigger changes in our body. For example, fear may produce widening of the eyes, changes in our body temperature, and so forth, which, as we talked about before, is kind of encompassing that autonomic nervous system. The locomotion and motor behaviors are another way of expression that may be involved in many emotional states. Fleeing in the presence of a threatening stimulus occurs in humans, but also fish, mice, birds, and other animals as well. The somatic expressions, they show neural connections between the peripheral organs and the brain that aid in our guiding behaviors. It also involves brain regions engaging between emotion expression and then the physiological feedback. Vocalizations, they go further than just using purposeful communication. Vocalization can happen in vocal outbursts, which are a good explanation of how we communicate with our emotions through our physical abilities. Paul Ekman actually studied facial expressions. He made this study across many cultures, studying 6 basic emotions to see how our anatomy is contingent even across cultures. Just showing that facial expressions are just as evolutionary and universal to classify our emotions in America or even in whitewater versus maybe in China. Some of those basic emotions are shared culturally, and I think that's very impactful biologically to understand exactly what that looks like in facial representation. So, why are they expressed this way? In order for us to communicate, if we did not have the biological ability to interact, it would probably be very challenging to identify and understand and to express our emotions. Emotions are expressed in this manner in order for communication to occur, and so that we can talk to ourselves, other individuals, and this has been continuous over generations and evolutions. Our systems communicate to us whether there's fear or there's happy. It also expresses our adaptability, I think, through obvious scientific evolution, proven facts and theories. We see that things do become adaptable, and our emotions and how we express them is also one thing that becomes adaptable. Through different situations or environments, our biological responses have to maintain appropriate in order to affect our physical and our mental being. We've gone through a lot of biological aspects to emotion, and I think it's very significant to understand the absolute power that biology does hold. Going through the power of biology lies in a lot of aspects. It aids emotions to be explained, the way we express them, the way we understand them, the way that we practice them, and more. We went over the comparative method a bit prior, just briefly, but I would kind of like to elaborate on it. I think that it provides a lot of significant comparisons to show how biology has aided humans in understanding emotions, and also through animals. Um, So the comparative method is the concept of internalizing the significant results of animals' emotions in order for us to understand our own emotional state. There's been lots of research, lots of applications to this method, and through all of the research and majority of study subjects, they are primary animals, and we can interpret the results to make it applicable to our human beings. And we've learned a lot by doing that. I think it's very powerful that biology allows us to study animals and take what we've learned, and apply it to humans, and we see that it is applicable and it is relatable, which also makes the efficacy of research that much valuable too. So science has made many discoveries through a lot of biological concepts, not even just in the field of studying emotions, but overall as well, to learn about cells and neurons and processes, regions, structures, all of the things that our body contains. Biology has allowed us to study it. And with the innate knowledge that biology provides us, we can depict our bodily states and use them to communicate and understand all of the cognitive processes more than we ever have before. Psychology has developed to look deeper than empirical, picking apart phenomena like never before. Instead of just thinking of our brain like a black box, right? We don't dive into it. What we see is what we know, has to be observable. We've grown beyond that with the power of our biological uses, and we can now dive into processes like with optogenetics. We can genetically modify something into a cell. We turn on a light and we activate a neuron. So things have gone much deeper than they ever have before. Biology, with its powerful discoveries, has been able to help that happen. We've learned how to survive better with biology, and we can understand way more about the living organisms that surround us. Now, with every discovery and theory, there are always limitations, myths that occur, misconceptions that are intertwined and might end up hindering the discoveries or the proposals that are made. So I wanted to go over a misconception of biology and emotions that occur in society that are not relevant but tend to sit like they're relevant. So to go over those, there are always going to be limitations. And Darwin had presented that emotions are innate states of mind and that fear, for example, is a cause of responses. And the extensive research that has been done regarding the amygdala and how it is actually not the fear center. It is involved to make feelings of fear, but it is not the fear center. Most people, when they learn about brain structures, will learn that the amygdala is the fear center, and that is inaccurate and could hinder our understanding of emotions and biology if that's what we had thought. We learn those responses of fear, but they are not innate, and the danger of a situation is what is universal to understanding fear. It's much more personal. So we learn response states. We do not inherently just know them, because danger is depicted and subjective to each situation, right? We all have different fears. I might not be fearful of spiders, but someone sitting next to me could be very fearful of spiders. So I wouldn't interpret that as a fearful situation, but they would. So understanding fear is not universal, it's not innate, it's very personal, and it's something that our own person has to depict for themselves. Emotions are, in fact, conscious experience or reactions after stimuli. Another misconception is the association of emotions and feelings, and they both can be used to refer to the same state, and that's wrong. Feelings are the experiences as a result of our emotions. So once again, feelings are the experiences as a result of our emotions. That was something it took me a long time to understand too, but I'm glad that I can now interpret things a little bit better in my own emotional and mental states, knowing the difference. All right, as we are nearing the end here, it's time that we ask the big question one more time. And I hope at this point you'll be able to provide me some answers as to why we need biology to understand emotions. So after everything we went through, I'm just going to run through it one more time. We have the biological basis, the physiological processes, species similarities, brain structures and influence, expressive factors, detection of threats, corrective measures, communication, interactions, all of those things that are biologically predisposed, we need to understand so that we can understand our emotions, right? So we need the biological foundation in order to understand our emotional states. There are many assumptions as to why biology is important for understanding our emotions. Our reactions to stimuli is what we classify as our emotions. And we could not determine where these emotions are coming from without physiological changes and our biological makeup. Everyone has different thresholds of emotions, and we all need to have that foundation of biology in order to depict and differentiate the meanings that emotions hold. All species exhibit some aspect of emotions that we have and can research. In fact, there's been research done to show that all living things have some sort of reaction to fear. We all need to understand the biological differences in order to understand the emotions as well. Meaning all living organisms that detect danger, they can then react on the stimuli. How would researchers have found that similarity in different species if it weren't for biology? So, as we went through brain structures and the influence that they have on emotions, each structure and process have a function or work together to serve many functions. Biology does matter. We would not be able to dive deep into the functions of any processes or any parts of our physical beings without having biology. There would be no genetic influence to analyze and attribute to without biology. We would go through complex experiences of bodily sensations and behaviors that tell us significance or meanings of things. And that's the experience that we have and we label of emotions. But without the biological understanding, that concept would mean absolutely nothing to us. So, after diving into the topic of biology and emotions and why we needed to understand our emotions, I'd just like to extend the opportunity if anybody has any questions, post it in the chat box. And now I would like to ask the question, why is biology important to understanding emotion?